The morning sun filtered through the towering glass ceiling of Westfield's shopping center, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Frank Martinez sat behind his modest security desk, a small island of calm in the sea of early morning activity. At 68, his uniform had seen better days. The navy blue fabric slightly faded from countless washings, the brass buttons dulled by time. His shoulders carried the weight of decades, hunched slightly forward as he reviewed the overnight incident reports. The mall was coming to life around him. Store managers hurried past with their morning coffee, janitors finished their final rounds, and the first wave of teenage employees trickled in for their shifts. Frank had been watching this same routine for 3 years now, ever since he'd taken the job after his retirement. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and gave him something to do with his days. "Morning, Frank," called out Sarah, a 19-year-old who worked at the jewelry store. She was part of a group of young employees who often gathered near his desk before their shifts began. Frank nodded politely and returned to his paperwork. "I swear, they hire anyone for security these days," whispered Jake, a college kid who worked at the electronics store. His voice carried just enough for Frank to hear. "Look at him. He can barely sit up straight. What's he gonna do if something actually happens? Chase down a shoplifter with his walker?" The group erupted in quiet laughter. Frank's pen paused for just a moment, then continued moving across the page. He'd heard it all before. To them, he was just another old man counting down the days until he could afford to fully retire. They saw the graying hair, the reading glasses, the way he sometimes winced when he stood up too quickly. They didn't see the 35 years of service that had earned him commendations, the countless hours of training, or the scars hidden beneath his uniform. "Maybe they should get him one of those mobility scooters," added Emma from the clothing store. "Then he could really patrol the mall in style." Frank allowed himself a small smile as he sipped his coffee. Let them think what they wanted. He'd learned long ago that underestimation could be its own kind of advantage. Besides, he genuinely hoped they'd never have to see what he was really capable of. The morning continued its familiar rhythm. Shoppers began to arrive, families with strollers, elderly couples taking their morning walks, teenagers meeting friends. Frank made his rounds, checking that all the stores had opened properly, ensuring the emergency exits were clear, and maintaining the visible presence that deterred most minor infractions. He paused at the fountain in the center court, watching children throw pennies and make wishes. Their laughter echoed off the high ceilings, mixing with the ambient sounds of conversation and distant music from the various stores. This was what he was here to protect, not just the merchandise or the property, but the sense of safety and normalcy that allowed people to go about their daily lives without fear. Frank! The voice belonged to Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who came to the mall every Tuesday for her physical therapy walks. "How are you doing today, dear?" "Just fine, Mrs. Chen. How's the walking going?" "Oh, you know, one foot in front of the other. The doctor says I'm making good progress." She paused, studying his face. "You know, you remind me of my late husband. He was in the military. Had that same way of watching everything without seeming to—" Frank's expression softened. "Thank you, ma'am. That's very kind." As Mrs. Chen continued her circuit, Frank reflected on her words. She was one of the few people who seemed to see past his current role to something deeper. Maybe it was because she'd lived through enough to recognize the signs of someone who'd seen more than his fair share of the world's darker corners. The day progressed quietly. Frank handled a minor dispute between two store managers about parking spaces, helped a lost child find her mother, and documented a small water leak near the food court. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines. Just the steady work of keeping a small piece of the world running smoothly. It was just after 2 o'clock when everything changed. The first sign was the sound. A woman's scream cutting through the ambient noise of the mall like a knife. Frank's head snapped up from his paperwork, his body already shifting into a different mode of alertness. The scream had come from the direction of the department store, past the jewelry counter where Sarah worked. Then came the second scream, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Frank was already moving, his coffee cup set down with the careful precision of someone who'd been trained never to waste motion in a crisis. As he rounded the corner towards the department store, he could see people running. Not the hurried walk of someone late for an appointment, but the flat-out sprint of pure panic. A mother clutched her toddler to her chest as she ran past him. A group of teenagers pushed past an elderly man in their haste to get away from something. "Gun! He's got a gun!" someone shouted. Frank's training kicked in with the automatic precision of muscle memory. His breathing steadied, his pace became measured and purposeful. While everyone else was running away from the danger, he walked steadily toward it. The department store's entrance was in chaos. People were diving behind clothing racks, pressing themselves against walls, some frozen in place by fear. And there, in the center of it all, was a figure in a black hoodie holding a pistol. The gunman appeared to be in his 20s, thin and jittery with the erratic movements of someone high on adrenaline or something stronger. He was waving the gun wildly, shouting demands that were barely coherent. Frank could see at least 15 people trapped in the store, too scared to move. "Everybody down! Down on the ground! Nobody move or I start shooting!" Frank assessed the situation with the cold calculation of someone who'd done this before. The gunman was agitated but not focused, his attention scattered across too many targets. The weapon appeared to be a 9mm semi-automatic, probably stolen given the way he was handling it, like he wasn't entirely familiar with its weight and balance. Most importantly, the gunman hadn't noticed Frank yet. He was fixated on the people directly in front of him, the ones who were crying and pleading. Frank had perhaps 30 seconds before the situation would either escalate or the gunman would become aware of his presence. Frank moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent decades learning to read dangerous situations. He approached from the gunman's left side, using the clothing racks as cover. Each step was calculated, each movement designed to avoid drawing attention. The gunman was still shouting, his voice growing more frantic. "I want all the money from the registers. Now! And somebody call the manager." Frank could see Sarah behind the jewelry counter, her face pale with terror. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Frank held up a single finger, a silent signal for her to stay calm and stay down. He was now less than 10 feet from the gunman, close enough to see the sweat on the young man's face, close enough to smell the fear and chemicals coming off him, close enough to act. The gunman suddenly spun around, perhaps sensing movement behind him. For a moment, he and Frank stared at each other across the small distance that separated them. The young man's eyes were wide with surprise and something that might have been drugs. "Hey, get back! I said get back!" Frank didn't respond. He simply continued his approach, his movements calm and deliberate. The gunman raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Frank's chest. "I'll shoot you, old man. I swear I'll shoot." Frank's expression didn't change. He'd had guns pointed at him before, had faced down men far more dangerous than this frightened kid. He could see the slight tremor in the gunman's hands, the way his finger hovered near the trigger but didn't quite commit to it. "You don't want to do that, son," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The gunman's response was to lunge forward, perhaps hoping to use the weapon as a club rather than firing it. It was exactly the wrong move against someone with Frank's training. Frank sidestepped the clumsy attack with fluid precision, his movement so smooth it seemed almost effortless. As the gunman stumbled past him, Frank's hand shot out and clamped down on the young man's wrist with iron grip. His other hand found the gunman's elbow, applying pressure to a nerve cluster that sent shooting pain up the entire arm. The gun fell from nerveless fingers as Frank executed a perfect leg sweep, sending the gunman crashing to the floor. Before the young man could even register what had happened, Frank had him pinned face down with one knee on his back, his arm twisted behind him in a control hold that made any resistance impossible. The entire encounter had taken less than 4 seconds. The store fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and muffled sobs. Everyone stared at the scene before them. The elderly security guard kneeling calmly over the would-be robber, the gun lying harmlessly on the floor several feet away. Jake from the electronics store was among the witnesses, his phone out and recording. "What the hell?" he whispered. "Was that judo? Karate? What was that?" Frank calmly reached over and picked up the fallen weapon, his movement still precise and controlled. He ejected the magazine and cleared the chamber with practiced efficiency, then set the gun carefully aside. The gunman beneath him had stopped struggling, either from pain or shock or both. "Someone call 911, Frank said conversationally, as if he were asking about the weather. "Tell them we have a situation under control, but need paramedics and police response." Sirens were already wailing in the distance. Frank maintained his position, keeping the gunman immobilized but not increasing the pressure unnecessarily. There was no anger in his face, no satisfaction, just the calm professionalism of someone doing a job that needed to be done. The first police officer to arrive was young, probably fresh out of the academy. He entered the store with his weapon drawn, clearly expecting to find an active shooter situation. Instead, he found an elderly man in a security uniform sitting calmly beside a subdued suspect. "Sir, I need you to step away from the—" "Officer," Frank interrupted gently, rising slowly with his hands visible. "I'm mall security. This individual attempted an armed robbery. The weapon is secured on the floor there. Magazine removed, chamber cleared." The young officer looked between Frank and the groaning suspect, trying to process what he was seeing. Who are you?" Frank smiled slightly. "I used to teach guys like you," he said simply. More police arrived, followed by paramedics and what appeared to be half the mall's management team. Frank gave his statement with the same calm precision he'd shown during the confrontation itself. He provided details about the suspect's behavior, his assessment of the weapon, and his decision to intervene. Detective Rodriguez, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force, interviewed Frank privately. "That was some pretty impressive work in there. You military—" "Police," Frank replied. 35 years with Metro PD, spent the last 15 running the tactical training program. Rodriguez nodded with understanding. SWAT? Among other things. Well, I'll be damned. No wonder you made it look so easy. Rodriguez closed his notebook. We'll need you to come down to the station later for a full statement, but from what I can see, this was a clean intervention. Probably saved a lot of lives today. As the police finished processing the scene, Frank found himself surrounded by the same group of young employees who'd been mocking him that morning. Their expressions had changed completely. Frank, Sarah said quietly, we had no idea. Thank you. Jake looked embarrassed. Man, I'm sorry about what I said earlier, about the Walker thing. That was really stupid. Frank waved off the apology. You had no reason to know. I prefer it that way, actually. But why? Emma asked. Why work here? I mean, you could probably get a job anywhere. Frank considered the question. Because this is where I'm needed. You don't always get to choose where you make your stand. Sometimes it chooses you. The next morning's newspaper featured a headline that would be picked up by national news outlets. Retired SWAT trainer saves dozens in mall standoff. The article detailed Frank's background, his years of service, and his quiet transition to mall security after retirement. But Frank didn't read the article. He was back at his desk, reviewing the overnight reports with the same careful attention he'd shown the day before. His coffee was still in the same mug, his uniform still slightly faded, his posture still carrying the weight of his years. The difference was in how people looked at him now. Store managers nodded respectfully as they passed. Teenagers spoke in quieter tones around his desk. Mrs. Chen stopped by to give him a small American flag pin for his uniform. I knew there was something special about you, she said with a knowing smile. Frank attached the pin to his uniform and returned to his paperwork. He was still the same man he'd been yesterday, still quiet, still observant, still ready to do whatever was necessary to protect the people in his care. The only thing that had changed was that now everyone else knew it too. As the morning settled into its familiar rhythm, Frank reflected on the strange turns life could take. He'd spent decades training for moments like yesterday, hoping they'd never come, but staying ready just in case. Now, in what was supposed to be his quiet retirement job, he'd found himself exactly where he needed to be when it mattered most. The mall opened for business, shoppers began to arrive, and life continued its normal course. Frank Martinez, 68 years old and still standing guard, sipped his coffee and smiled faintly to himself. Some people might see him as just another old man in a faded uniform, but he knew better now, and so did they. The Guardian was still watching, still ready, still there when the world needed him to be.